Morning, Dan and Amy, and oh boy,
Yes.
President Obama is just losing friends left and right. And I'm not talking about, Joe Biden packing up all the ceremonial scissors from the shovel-ready projects and not succeeding, as far as I know, in curing cancer like he was supposed to before the end of the Obama regime. I'm talking about this piece in the Atlantic by Garrett Epps, who's otherwise an apologist, and he concedes the point, saying, even for those like me who admire the 44th president, the constitutional record is disturbingly mixed. Obama leaves the Constitution weaker than he found it, says the left-leaning Atlantic, and one of its scriveners, Garrett Epps. Now, he focuses on things that have to do with war and peace, the drone program and the like matters with respect to surveillance and FISA court and the inability to get Gitmo formally closed and so forth, not matters that I would include, like matters in the areas of religious liberty or the backdoor takeover of the health insurance market called Obamacare. But boy, oh boy, Obama leaves the Constitution weaker than he found it. That's just a fact, writes Garrett Epps in The Atlantic. How about them apples, Amy? And just quickly, too, Anthony Bourdain, a very fun interview.
Oh, yeah.
Anthony Bourdain from Parts Unknown, the No Reservations, does all these restaurant shows.
Best show ever.
Yeah, he's
Love it.
he's an irreverent type. He is asked in an interview he gave in Reason magazine, "You're a liberal. What should liberals be critiquing their own side for?" Bourdain, "There's just so much. I hate the term political correctness. The way in which speech that is found to be unpleasant or offensive is often banned from universities, which is exactly where speech that is potentially hurtful and offensive should be heard." He goes on to say, "The utter contempt with which privileged Eastern liberals such as myself discuss red state gun country working class Americans as ridiculous and morons and rubes is largely responsible for the upswell of rage and contempt and desire to pull down the temple that we're seeing now." There's a little bit of proper self-reflection from a self-described liberal like Bourdain. And just a quick addition to this. I just want to get this in.
What?
He's asked what he thinks of Bill Maher, Bourdain. Bourdain says of Bill Maher, "Insufferably smug. Really the worst of the smug, self-congratulatory left. I have a low opinion of him. I did not have an enjoyable experience on his show, not a show I plan to do again. He's a classic example of the smirking, contemptuous, privileged guy who lives in a bubble, and he's in no way looking to reach outside or even look outside of that bubble in an empathetic way." Boy. Tell you, all kinds of truth being spoken to and from power. And for more of that, we're pleased to be joined by our friend Congressman Peter Roskam, Republican from Illinois 6, of course, hails from God's country, Wheaton, Illinois.
Oh, boy.
Peter, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Dan and Amy, good to be with you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. And so we've got the repeal of Obamacare moving, and there's some debate, it seems, about a delay in the replace. And what is the temperature of the House Republican caucus on the pace and form of what replaces Obamacare?
The interest is to move fast. So the vice president came in yesterday, as you know, and urged us to move quickly, and there's an appetite to move quickly. The name of the game is a good, smart, crisp transition out of Obamacare and onto a market-driven system, and the type of system that we've been longing for a long time. And it's interesting, the architects of Obamacare created it as a prelude to a single-payer system. It was designed to fail, but it failed too quickly for them. And so now one of two things was going to happen. Their desire was for it to crash into a single-payer system, for all the healthcare delivery process to atrophy in the years that Obamacare was up in place. The system crashes, and then a single-payer system is the only thing that can come up out of it. But it crashed too fast. And so now we've got an opportunity to really put together a healthcare system that goes and does two things. Number one, removes the cost drivers that have made healthcare too expensive. And also, let's figure out how to deal with this complicated problem of pre-existing conditions. And we can do those two things. They're not mutually exclusive. But in answer to your question, people want to move quickly.
Well, how long do you think it's going to take before there's
think
more
it's gonna take
competition
this-
out there and costs are driven down?
In answer to your question, Amy, I think it's going to take this Congress to get that done. So to repeal is, that's simple. That's a simple vote moving forward, and that's going to move quickly. And then getting the systems in place, it's like building out anything else. But there is a real urgency to getting this done and getting this done this Congress.
And Nancy Pelosi has suggested, they've had 5 years. The Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer talking point is, you've had 5 years, you got no ideas, they don't have a replacement to propose. There has been legislation introduced previously, like by the soon-to-be HHS Secretary, Dr. Tom Price. Is that, like Price's bill, is that the form that a replacement is likely to take?
I think it is. So you've got Price's bill. Back during the the Obamacare plan, there was a Ways and Means alternative that never got any attention by the Democrats, that the Congressional Budget Office reviewed and said this will actually lower health care costs. So, to Pelosi's point, now is time for the GOP to put up the alternative, and that's what we're in the process of putting together. But in answer to your question, time is essential. And look, in order to maintain the faith and the consistency with the campaign pledge that Republicans have communicated up and down the campaign trail, and Trump and Pence talked about in their campaign, it's got to happen as quickly as possible.
I want to ask you, were you part of that clandestine meeting, I think, on Monday night where, without warning, House Republicans voted to gut the Independent Ethics Office?
Well, so let's rewind the tape.
Yes.
This is an office that Nancy Pelosi created when she and the Democrats took the majority. The United States Senate does not have this office. It's a special office. And it allows anonymous complaints to come in, and it allows people to have accusations made against them, and no opportunity to confront an accuser. So the press characterized it as gutting. I would say reforming and updating so that you give normal due process rights to people who are accused of something. And I think it's a good idea to reform it. There was obviously a mischaracterization and a huge outcry about it. But I think this is one of these things. It's got to be updated, and it's got to be reformed. And at the very least, the United States Senate should be living by the exact same rules that the House does.
Right, and so the opposition, by the way, that there's a committee that has oversight over this independent watchdog, too. So it wasn't like there was no then investigative body if this committee were to be, if this independent entity was to be reformed in some measure. But in terms of anonymous complaints, so I just want to be clear. There's not an opposition to anonymous complaints. Sometimes, whistleblower, they don't want to come forward even with whistleblower protection. It's the question of, if you're going to take up an anonymous complaint and investigate it, then there has to be a chance to respond before you start issuing press releases or that sort of thing. Is that is that kind of the sense of it?
That's it exactly. So this was really tempest in the teapot, but to come right out of the gate and want to reform these rules, it got a lot of attention. But these are rules that really need to be updated and changed. And at the very least, look, if it's good for the House, the Senate should be living by this standard.
Okay, well then why did you guys scrap the plans?
Pardon me?
Why did you reverse course? Why did you scrap the plans to do it?
There wasn't enough support to make the changes. I didn't reverse course. I think you need to make these changes. But the House leadership ultimately said, we're not going to deal with this.
That's an optics problem. I think
it was a mistake.
All right, so I want to get to the governing agenda. You've heard Trump and Pence restate a lot of the things they said in the campaign. As you mentioned, Pence's meeting yesterday with the leadership in both chambers, talking about repeal of Obamacare on day one, intimating Trump may take some executive actions in that direction on day one as well. There's been discussion about structural tax reform. There's been discussion about immigration reform, including the construction of a wall being a first 100 days priority. What are the things that you're going to pay particular attention to, focus your work on in terms of structural reforms, rethinking of the federal government with the new administration?
I'm going to be spending a tremendous amount of time on tax reform. We've got a tax code that's a disaster. Nobody's defending the status quo. The shine is completely off the penny of the enforcement agency, that is the IRS. And if we can reform our tax code and make it simpler for families so that 95% of Americans can fill their form out on a basically a one sheet of paper, a postcard essentially, and make the U.S. the most competitive tax jurisdiction in the world, that will be a huge accomplishment. And I am absolutely convinced with the election of Trump and Pence, we have moved from tax reform being, like a 5% possibility into now being more likely true than not true. I think that 2017 is going to be the year for tax reform. And I think from my constituency's point of view, they're begging for mercy underneath this tax code. And it doesn't matter if you're, a family in a very modest situation or you're running a company out in the burbs that's doing business all over the world. They are really begging for mercy under this tax code.
Now, can I propose an idea that may help to curry some bipartisan favor for whatever?
Of course.
Yeah. So I'm thinking this tax amnesty provision in the structural reforms, the reduction of the corporate personal rates, for anybody who has now or previously hosted a show on MSNBC, because according to a Heat Street review, there's 6 current MSNBC pundits and hosts and 3 that have just left who have, amassed
outstanding tax bills,
millions of dollars in tax liens. And I just think if you, give a Chris Matthews, you give an Al Sharpton, you give a Craig Melvin. I don't know who these people are. If you give them a break, then maybe that's a way to curry favor with, Nancy Pelosi and her friends.
Hey, I'll see it and I'll raise it. How about this? We give former Obama Treasury officials like Timothy Geithner,
who
didn't pay his taxes before he went in. Let's give him an amnesty program too.
Or at least give every Democrat member of Congress and former Obama cabinet secretaries a complimentary copy of TurboTax. How about that? I mean, there's got to be a way to work this out. All right. He is Peter Roskam, Congressman from Illinois' 6th Congressional District. Peter, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
You guys.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
If you're talking about it, Dan and Amy are talking about it. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.